applying to medical school, everything you ever wanted to know, social life, academics, MCAT, AMCAS, and I could throw a bunch of other things on there because we're going to go over a lot of stuff today. Basically, what we're going to be able to do is really give you the option of, or really give you a understanding of the pre-med process from a couple of different angles, focusing in a little bit on your social life, your academics, the MCAT, as well as the actual application to medical school. And I wanted to take a few seconds to introduce myself and our other host today. So I'm Mehta. I founded Med School Coach. I have been doing this for the last 10 years and have helped thousands of students into medical school at this point, and have kind of seen every single permutation and combination out there of students looking to get into medical school, whether it's help through their personal statement, their activities, figuring out what they should do in a gap year or take a gap year, whatever it might be. I'm here to help you with that. And I wanted to take a minute to introduce our two co-hosts, Dr. Ziggy. Ziggy, you out there?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. You want to say hi and just give a brief background about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Ziggy Yoediono. I trained as a psychiatrist at Harvard Longwood, and as you can see on the slide here, I'm currently the founder of Zig Consulting, which is a luxury boutique education and career advisory firm for college students. And in my prior life, as you can see on the slide, I was the associate director of a business master's program at Duke. And I also have experience doing admissions interviewing for Harvard, Yale, Duke, and the University of Rochester.
Awesome, Ziggy. So I really thank Dr. Ziggy for joining us. I think he's going to bring an awesome perspective, particularly, for those students out there who are early in the college process, who are maybe, just trying to get their feet wet, understand what activities that you get involved in, understand how to do well academically. Dr. Ziggy is really an expert in a lot of that stuff. And then I also want to introduce Dr. Ken Tao, who's Med School Coach's Director of MCAT Programming. Ken, you want to say hi?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Ken. I am the Director of MCAT Programming at Med School Coach. Prior to joining the Med School Coach, I was at the Princeton Review for many years as an MCAT instructor, tutor, and trainer for them. So I have a lot of experience working with all types of students, and I'm looking forward to helping you guys answer all types of questions about the MCAT.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken. So I really, again, want you guys to take the opportunity to ask questions of us as you go. So use that question and answer session. What I'm going to do really quickly is just launch a quick poll to understand where you guys are in the process. Hopefully you guys are seeing the poll. So go ahead and answer this question so that we can understand a little bit about where you are to help tailor this presentation a little bit. Now, keep in mind that this presentation has a lot of really awesome facts in it, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it, but I'm not going to dwell too much on every single one of them. Instead, I want to provide you that big picture overview and give you guys a real opportunity to understand the process. So it looks like we got a lot of awesome people out here, so I'm just going to share these results. We have a lot of people that are still many years away from applying, 2+ years away, I assume, and then a lot of people who are going to be applying this upcoming year. Perfect. We have a couple people in the application process right now. Also great. You're going to get some great information if you guys are out there. And then a couple parents out there. Love talking to parents. Love having you guys out here. So without further ado, I am actually going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Ziggy here. And actually, sorry, before that, let me give you a little bit of a overview of what we're going to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about academics and social life as a pre-med, and that's going to include, how you can do well, setting goals, and then we're going to talk about the MCAT, and specifically, Ken is going to get into talking about creating an effective study plan, as well as tips and tricks for the CARS section, which is one of the hardest sections, the sections that a lot of students find hard. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about extracurriculars that medical schools are looking for, as well as the application. Personal statement, AMCAS, transcript, grades, everything that goes into it. And then probably the best part of the whole webinar is going to be this question and answer period at the end, where again, you're going to get to choose the ask us questions, and we're going to save plenty of time for that so that we can get through as many questions as possible. I have this big 40% number up there, and the reason I have that number is to scare you guys a little bit, because 40% is the amount of people who matriculate to medical school who apply through the AMCAS application. So that means that 6 out of 10 people essentially don't get into medical school any year that they apply. that's a lot. This is one of the most competitive processes in the entire, I would say, spectrum of applications anywhere. So how do you make yourself, in that 40% who eventually do get into med school? And keep in mind, that's even for people who get to the application process. There's a lot of people who drop out way before then. We're going to try to get you into that 40%. We're going to try to give you some advice to get you into that percentage that gets into medical school. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ziggy here, who's going to go over some of the academic social life parts of medical school. Dr. Y, you want to take it away?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking today about one of the things is academics and making the most of meetings. So in my prior life, one of the things I was a college academic advisor at Duke. So a lot of the academic advice I gave for both pre-meds and non-pre-meds was often along the lines of, preparing earlier and doing more practice problems, things that you guys probably already know. But one of the issues that rarely came up when I spoke with students, but I realized was actually a major problem, but they didn't realize it was a problem, and even I didn't realize at the time, was making the most of meetings, So to take a step back, in high school, much of the information that you needed to succeed was often handed to you, pretty much on a silver platter, basically. But if you want to optimize your pre-med experience, and by that I mean not only excelling in terms of academics, but also in terms of extracurriculars and ultimately getting into medical school, you have to be very, very proactive about reaching out to faculty and staff and meeting with them, and ideally one-to-one meetings, basically. But the thing is, a meeting, however, isn't just about showing up and winging it. Which unfortunately a lot of people do. You really want to impress the person who's taking time out of her busy day to meet with you and convince her that you're worth developing a professional relationship with. Very, very important, and because that'll help you in many ways. And the key, to making the most of a meeting, like many things in life, is preparation. So a day or two before any meeting, whether it's in person, online, or via telephone, I always do the following 3 things. Number 1, I know this sounds obvious, but I always figure out what's the goal of the meeting. Specifically, what do I want to accomplish by the time the meeting ends? This sounds very obvious, but I can tell you from a lot of personal experience, a lot of people often don't do this and just end up rambling. So and in addition, I try to make the goal as measurable as possible so that I can assess whether or not I achieved it by the time the meeting ends. And then once I figure it out, I literally write it at the top of a sheet of paper to serve as a guide. The problem is if you don't have a goal, you're not going to know what to talk about during the meeting, and it'll be like driving around without a destination. And then step 2, once I've determined the goal, I do a lot of research on the person I'm going to meet, and also, if appropriate, on the organization that he or she belongs to. Now, this might seem a little bit odd since the meeting is supposed to be about you, but let me tell you from personal experience, the more that you know about that person that you're going to meet with, the more specific questions that you can ask, which in turn will impress that person and could create more opportunities for you. And in particular, you want to pay attention when you're doing research to, not surprisingly, the person's resume, which is often very easy to look up online. More specifically, their educational background, their work experience, their research, even personal interests. A lot of times you can discover something that will help you ask better questions and could even inspire you. And then the third step is, in preparing for a meeting, is to come up with the agenda, which is, i.e. the meat and potatoes of the meeting. And this not only includes all the questions that you plan to ask or issues that you want to discuss, but, which is something people often forget, anticipating questions that you think they're going to ask you and preparing for them ahead of time. And on your agenda, or at least when I create an agenda, I always have 2 things on there at the very least, and I usually save it for the end. The first thing is that I often ask who else I should talk to. You want to connect with as many experts as possible, and one of the best ways to do that is through referrals. And the second thing is I always have a follow-up plan with the person I'm meeting, whether it's, okay, I'm going to send you an email later to sort of summarize what we talked about or do all these things that we discussed. the last thing you want is you don't want that first meeting to be the last one. Every initial meeting that you have with someone should serve as a springboard for developing a long-term relationship, because those long-term relationships can potentially lead to that person serving as a mentor, getting other connections, that person writing letters of recommendation or serving as a reference, and creating a lot of opportunities. So those are the 3 steps I always follow in making the most of a meeting.
So those are so interesting, Ziggy, because I mean, I think one of the things that pre-meds often don't understand is maybe the value of mentorship in the entire process, right? They don't find the right person to connect with. They don't, maybe it's as simple as like, they don't even meet with their professors early on. And then they realize that, oh shoot, 3 years later, I need letters of recommendation. Who was I supposed to get it from? Well, if you had sort of taken this time to maybe meet with that professor, maybe, you know, talk to people in the field, I think you can really make a huge impact in your application later on. And so for those of you guys who are 2+ years away from applying, I think, you know, this advice that Ziggy just gave, I think is really imperative for you guys when you do make those meetings. It's like, take the first step and want those meetings, get connected, get mentors, and then I think those 3 steps are awesome to really make the most of each one of them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Going on, the second thing I'm going to be talking about is the social life and making the most of pre-med friends. So I'm going to tell you something that you guys already know, that being a pre-med is a very long and challenging path. So therefore, it's really critical that you have a variety of support systems. You know, of course, you have your family and your college in terms of advisors and other types of support systems. But one of the very best support systems that you can have is friends, and in particular, friends who are fellow pre-meds, because, you know, they're going exactly through the same thing that you're doing day in and day out, and therefore they can really relate to all the ups and downs of your journey. Now, this is not to say that you shouldn't have non-pre-med friends. You should absolutely befriend whoever you want, but having just a few pre-med friends that you can really trust will make your pre-med journey more successful in 3 ways. The first way, as you can see on the slide, is in terms of acing academics. So, you know, everyone knows that pre-med courses are very challenging. But when you have a fellow pre-med friends that you can study together with, you are much more likely to be able to overcome these challenges that you face, whether it's in terms of, you know, understanding concepts, solving problems, or following lab instructions. And the reason is because everyone has different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to pre-med subjects. So, you know, for example, you may be awesome at general chemistry, but really struggle at physics, while you might have a friend who's really great at physics, but, you know, struggling in general chemistry or something like that. And that means you can really help each other out in terms of figuring out concepts and solving problems. And furthermore, for material, you know, such as biology, that requires more rote memorization, you can also test one another once you've studied the material. Number 2, the other way is in terms of medical school applications. You know, while of course you're gonna do your own applications and get your own letters of recommendation and do your own interviews, having fellow pre-med friends can still make a big difference in the most positive of ways. And the first way is that you are able to provide constructive feedback on content and organization, and also proofread each other's applications, particularly essays. And in terms of proofreading, you know, and I speak from personal experience, you should do this no matter what, because let me tell you, no matter how many times you read your own applications, you can still easily overlook mistakes. So having a fresh pair of eyes makes a huge difference. The second way that having pre-med friends can help is doing mock interviews with one another. You know, the person who's in the role of the interviewer can give the interviewee feedback in terms of content, organization, and behavior. So for instance, you know, did you say the word too much, too many times? Or did you have good eye contact? Was your handshake strong enough? You know, it's hard to know this stuff if you're just doing it by yourself. And ideally, you should do these mock interviews repeatedly with the same person so you can track one another's progress. And finally, you can share tips and experiences with one another as you visit medical schools, especially if you've gotten interviews at the same one. And now for slide 3. The other big way that having pre-med friends can help is what I call savoring social life. You know, it's really critical to carve out time for yourself to have fun. Otherwise, you will get burned out. So again, while it's great to have friends who are not pre-med, having pre-med friends can make a big difference in terms of your social life, in terms of making it less stressful, since they're dealing with the same challenge of trying to find, also a healthy academic and social life balance. Therefore, they're more likely to understand maybe why you might not have as much time to hang out, or why you're complaining so much about organic chemistry. So I think those are the benefits of having some pre-med friends.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Ziggy just talked a lot about, I would say, some of the most important things to think about when you are early in your career or early in your med school process, right? I mean, so much emphasis is placed on the MCAT, so much emphasis is placed on the application, and rightfully so in a lot of ways. But I talk about those people who don't even make it to applying to medical school. The reason they don't make it is because they don't follow some of that advice of having a real social life, of getting situated correctly in your college career, and so much of that is super important. So, and take some of that advice really to heart as you guys who are early on in the process think about it. I mean, you can definitely think about the specifics of the personal statement and interviews and the MCAT, but thinking about your life and your college career more holistically, probably makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. Awesome. So before we switch over to Ken, I wanted to launch another quick poll for you guys out there, which reads, what section of the MCAT are you most worried about? So for those of you guys who haven't taken the MCAT yet, which section worries you the most? For those of you guys that don't even know what the sections of the MCAT are, here they are. There are 4 sections on the new MCAT. It changed in 2015 to include things like psychology and sociology, and renamed some of the old sections, like what used to be called verbal reasoning is now called CARS. So which section are you guys most worried about out there? Awesome. So understandably, CARS comes in first. Chem physics comes in essentially second, bio third, and I guess not a lot of people are worried about the psych-soc section. Sorry. So what I want to do now is actually turn it over to Ken, who's going to take you guys through creating an effective study plan, as well as sort of some of the best tips and tricks for the CARS section, which you guys are all scared for.
All right, so the first thing I do want to comment on is on that survey. So those the most often as the top 2 sections that students are concerned with, the CARS section as well as the Chem Phys. So CARS, of course, is concerning because as pre-medical students, you're used to taking all this coursework on all this scientific content that you can study and learn and memorize to answer questions. But the CARS section is very different because there is no content for you to study. So that's a very common concern. For the Chem Phys section, that's also a very common concern because that section tests the most subjects. You've got general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biochemistry, and biology all tested on one section of the exam. All right, so what I want to talk about is 3 topics, one on creating an effective study plan, next on tips for the CARS section, and the third about improving your score substantially. So the first part of creating an effective study plan, I want to divide this into 2 topics. The first is, what are the important components of an effective study plan? And the second is how to schedule that study plan. So if you look at the different bullet points that we have on here, you might actually recognize, if you've spoken with other pre-medical students before, that these are some of the most common mistakes that students will make when preparing for the MCAT. So number 1, of course, is not giving themselves enough time to study. Number 2 is not doing enough content review, right? Really just thinking that they did well in their college courses, so they'll probably be okay on the MCAT. And number 3 is actually, in many ways, the opposite, spending too much time on content review and not doing enough practice. So, of course, this goes without saying, but for preparing for the MCAT, you definitely want to make sure that you give yourself enough time to study for the MCAT. This isn't something that you're just, putting off on the side, but you're really giving yourself a dedicated period of time to focus on the MCAT. And just to throw out a number for you, the average pre-medical student spends about 300 hours studying for the MCAT. So that, of course, can be done over a summer if you've got a pretty free summer, or it can also be done over the course of a semester if you're studying part-time. Now, for content review, this is important. There are a lot of questions in the MCAT that you cannot answer if you do not know the basic scientific concepts. However, at the same time, the MCAT is not a test of rote memorization. It's a test of application, where on the MCAT, you're going to be presented with a lot of passages that are going to introduce new information and situations that you've never seen before. And you're going to be asked to consider this information and recognize that this information is just testing the content you're supposed to know, but in a new situation that you're unfamiliar with. And you can really only practice this application by doing practice questions. And as I'm going to mention a couple times today, the best practice questions out there are those created by the AAMC, who are the writers of the MCAT. Now, the last thing you'll see on here is intensive review of all questions. This is a less commonly made mistake by pre-medical students, and that's because a lot of students know they need to do content review, then they need to do practice questions. So where students make this mistake is when they're doing all these practice tests and their scores are just a flat line. They're not seeing improvements, and yet they take more and more practice tests. The reason why these student scores are flatlining is generally because they're not taking the time to review the questions that they're getting incorrect, to figure out why they're getting those questions wrong and what they need to do so they don't get those questions wrong again. And of course, equally important is reviewing the questions that you got correct and making sure you understand why you got those questions correct so you'll continue getting those questions correct. So these are the main components of an effective study plan. So now, in terms of setting up your study plan, what you don't want to do is just say, okay, let me just start studying for the MCAT. I'm going to start, reading a set of MCAT books, and as I get through them, I'll transition to doing more practice tests. That's what a lot of students do, but the problem with that approach is you'll often fall behind. So as you approach your test date, you'll recognize, oh, wow, I only have 4 weeks to go, but I haven't finished my books, and I still have all these practice tests that I want to do. So usually in those situations, students will either just, take the test and kind of rush through it and, unfortunately not perform to the best of their abilities, or they'll push back their test date. Now, pushing back the test date is totally fine because giving yourself more time to study for the MCAT is never a bad thing. However, since a lot of you are planning on applying for medical school next summer, you do want to be careful about the timeline, that generally you want to take the MCAT by April or May, because if you take the MCAT over the summer, that may delay your medical school application. So to try to stick to an MCAT test date and be ready for that, you want to work backwards in setting up your schedule. So whatever your date is, you want to consider what are the different components of studying, which I just described on the last slide. And generally, the last thing you're going to do before taking your MCAT is doing all of the AAMC practice questions. Now, it takes about 120 hours to complete the 2,000 AAMC practice questions that have been released so far. So you want to work backwards from that number. If you can study 20 hours each week, that means you need to start the AAMC practice questions 6 weeks before your MCAT test date. If you can study 30 hours each week, that means you need to start these questions 4 weeks before that test date. Then before that, you're going to want to finish your content review. So in terms of finishing your content review, generally, most students are going to want to read a set of MCAT textbooks. Your MCAT textbooks have a lot of chapters. If you've seen the books, they are very thick, and there's a lot of them. So again, this is something you want to map out on your calendar. Figure out how much time it takes for you to read each chapter and essentially multiply that time by the number of chapters they are, so you can work backwards again from your deadline for content review, So that way you know how much time to give yourself to read all of the MCAT books. So if you have that as the timeline, as you're studying for the MCAT, you can constantly check your schedule to see, am I on pace to be ready for my MCAT test date? And sometimes you might fall behind a little, but it's good to have that schedule because you know next week or the following week, you can put in more hours to make sure you can catch up so you can stick to your schedule. You'll also see in here, I have 2 items that are optional. This is essentially just depending on how much time you have available to prepare for the MCAT exam. So certainly taking a diagnostic test can be helpful for a lot of students. And this is particularly helpful to identify if there are particular sections of the MCAT that you feel very weak on, or not feel weak on, that you are weak on. Now, at the same time, I'd also say a diagnostic test is not helpful for all students, and that's because whenever you take a diagnostic test, you're almost guaranteed to get a score you're not happy with. And that score you're not happy with basically tells you you need to study for the MCAT, which is not any new information. So in that sense, the diagnostic test can be considered optional. The other optional item is non-AAMC practice questions. The AAMC practice questions are the best questions out there, but unfortunately, there's a limited number of those questions available. So for many students, the 2000 AAMC questions is more than plenty for you to learn how to apply your knowledge of science to MCAT questions. However, for other students, they're going to want to do more practice questions. And at this point, you're going to have to rely on third-party practice questions. And there's many test prep companies that you can use for these practice questions. But I will comment that if you want to do questions from third-party companies, make sure you're doing them before the AAMC practice questions. You don't want to mix them in with the AAMC practice questions. And that's just because these questions from other companies, while they try to imitate the MCAT, they don't do a perfect job. So you will want to spend dedicated time focusing on the AAMC questions so you learn specifically how the MCAT phrases their questions and tests students' content.
So, you know, Ken's brought up some awesome points here about the MCAT study plan. And I think one of the most important ones is figuring out first when you want to take the MCAT. And so blending this together with figuring out when you want to get into medical school is important. So for those of you guys out there who are thinking about applying to medical school and basically going right after college, essentially not taking a gap year. And we'll talk a little bit about gap years, which are becoming more and more popular. In fact, I would say probably 60 to 70% plus of students going to medical school are taking gap years. But for those who are not, you are looking at having your MCAT to be taken in your junior year at some point, most likely in the spring of your junior year, so that you can apply in the late spring, early summer of your junior year. So basically, that's when you want to have your MCAT taken. If you're not taking a gap year, if you are taking a gap year or two or many, then you have a lot more flexibility potentially in when you can take the MCAT and when you have to have it by. But essentially, you want to have a score by the time you apply or shortly after you apply, which is typically June of the year that you're applying. So if you're looking to start school in 2020, that means you're going to submit an application in June of 2019. That means I want your MCAT score out by around June of 2019. So that's a good indication. So think about that as you guys are planning out where you guys are going to go. So Ken, turning it back to you for some cars.
All right, so the car section, as I mentioned, this is a tricky section for a lot of students. So here are a few very helpful tips that hopefully you can keep in mind as you're preparing for the section. So the first tip is read with enthusiasm. It is so common for me to speak with pre-medical students who are science majors. You know, you're studying biochemistry, biology, physics, and chemistry, and you're very interested and fascinated with all the scientific concepts. But when you come to some of these passages in the car section, you're like, oh, you know, this philosophy, you know, economics, art, history is just not interesting. And, you know, I just feel so bored when I'm reading these passages. And that is actually a major issue because if all you're thinking while you're reading these passages is how bored you are, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually comprehend what the passage is talking about. And if you're not able to focus on what the passage is about, it's going to be very tough for you to answer those CARS questions. So the first recommendation is definitely when you're reading the CARS passage, read with focus, read with enthusiasm. Basically, try to read it as if this is the most exciting text that you've ever written, that you've ever read before. And that is certainly going to be much better than reading the passage thinking that you're just bored. A second important tip here is accuracy before speed. This is another extremely common issue that I see with students. Students come up to me all the time and they say that, I have an issue with pacing on the CARS section. I never finish the section on time. I always have to rush through the last few passages. And yes, it's true. Pacing is tough for the CARS section as well as the other sections of the exam. However, my first advice to all of these students is, all right, first, why don't you try to do a few passages on timed? Give yourself as much time as you want for each passage. Give yourself 30 minutes or an hour for every single passage if you want. And see first if you can get 100% of the questions correct, or at least 80% of the questions correct. And for many of these students, they'll do that quick exercise and they won't be able to get a satisfactory accuracy to get the CARS score that they want. So in these situations, the obvious response is that speed is not the problem. Accuracy is the problem. So for these students, they really need to focus on improving their accuracy before they focus on pacing. And that's something that is much easier to address, pacing, as opposed to, how do I get more questions correct? Now, the third tip that I have here is actually one to help with pacing. And that is, on the CARS section, when you look at a lot of the questions, a lot of them, you can divide them into two types: questions with targeted detail and questions without targeted detail. So these questions with targeted details are the ones that say, what is the meaning of so-and-so in the passage? And so-and-so is some text that is quoted within the passage, right? These are the questions that are referring students to a specific part of the text and asking about that text. For these questions, you do need to go back to the passage. However, there are other questions where it doesn't refer to any specific part of the text. These are questions that you can consider to be main idea questions. So for these questions, you're not going to be able to find the answer in any specific part of the text. What you want to do for these questions is don't go back to the text. Instead, use your general understanding of the passage from reading it to answer the question. So the mistake I see here all the time from students is, for questions with targeted detail where they should go back to the passage, they don't go back to the passage and try to answer the question from their memory. And also the opposite, questions on main ideas where students shouldn't go back to the passage, I see them go back to the passage and they end up rereading the entire passage to get the answer. So those are common issues that if you think about and you can address, can certainly help with pacing. The last tip here is read MCAT CARS-like text regularly. This goes back to the first text. If you're not used to reading CARS-like text, articles about the social sciences, then this is something you want to try to do more regularly. So that way, reading these texts don't seem like as much of a chore, and it's actually something that you're used to reading. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is for students that are retaking the exam, how to improve your score substantially. So what you don't want to do is just take the exam and think, oh, the score that I got was just a fluke. Let me just, try to study a little bit more for the exam and retake it. Or, I feel like I could have done more content review. Let me go do more content review and take the exam again. So this is not what you want to do for the MCAT, because the MCAT is very important for medical school. And it's also very important that you don't take the MCAT, too many times, because it starts to become a red flag for medical schools when they see students with too many MCAT scores. So each time you retake the MCAT, you really want to think carefully about what you did right as well as what you did wrong the previous attempt. You want to figure out what you did wrong in order to identify how to change your study approach for your next attempt. Essentially, you don't want to retake the MCAT and end up with the same score again. So making sure you reflect and identify your weaknesses, and whatever those weaknesses are, make sure you develop an effective approach to address that weakness. That's going to make it much more likely for you to improve your score substantially. And sometimes this can be tough for you to think about because, when you think about your studying, you might feel like I worked very hard. I put in a lot of hours. I did all these things that I felt like was important for the exam, but still didn't score well. So in those situations, I would definitely recommend asking for help. And there are a lot of people you can ask. Certainly you can ask us, where we know the MCAT very well, but you can also ask your peers. So your fellow pre-medical students that did fantastic on the MCAT, you can describe to them what you did on the MCAT and ask them, is there anything that you did that they felt was incorrect, or anything that you didn't do that they feel you should try doing to improve your MCAT score?
Awesome. So there's so many great questions that people are asking already out there, which is just awesome. And we're going to get to a lot of them. Ken just went over a lot about the MCAT, and it's not to scare you, but the MCAT is incredibly important in the application process. I mean, at the end of the day, medical schools definitely will weed you out based on your MCAT score. That's the bottom line. You really need to score at least this is really at the very least a 505 or above or so to even be considered for MD schools. Obviously, there's some exceptions depending on your background and what else you've done. But I mean, really, I think most students should be looking to score 510, 515 to have a shot at US MD schools. Osteopathic schools, you can take a few points off of that, but not many. And so really scoring well is just absolutely necessary. And for those of you guys out there, there's a lot of resources. Ken went over some of them. You're going to find AMC resources. You're going to find Princeton Review, Kaplan, Next Step, ourselves. You're going to find, Khan Academy. There's all kinds of resources out there. One of the things that we really try to do is help you guys figure out which are the best resources, pair you up with somebody who understands it, can tutor you through it, and really get you the best score possible. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end here. But what I want to talk about for a few minutes is, and I really just want to take a few minutes, there's a lot of information on the upcoming slides, but a lot of the questions that I get often, especially from people who are early, are how many hours of X do I need? How many hours of community service, shadowing, medical activities, leadership research? And I just want to try to answer those questions briefly to give you some insights. I'm not going to go over a huge amount, but just a little bit. So, community service, and as I mentioned these numbers, I want you guys to think about them, but let's not, paint these in stone or engrave these in stone, right? Obviously, there's some flexibility depending on who you are and depending on what your background is, but this is kind of what I would say most people should be looking for, okay? Essentially, you should be looking for a minimum of 36 hours. And really, the average applicant probably has around 100 hours of community service of some sort, right? Being involved in a service activity, not being paid for it, volunteering. You guys know what community service is, obviously, but you're really looking for about 100 hours over the course of your college career. Now, in terms of leadership, this is important, right? Medical schools are looking for future physicians who are inherently leaders, right? I mean, as a physician, you're a leader of a team, you're a leader of the healthcare team, and they want to see that you've done things in your undergrad career to become this. So really, I want to see at minimum 1 leadership experience. And really, again, the average is more like 3 different leadership experiences, each lasting at least 3 months, within that 4-year period. So that could be on the executive board of Y, it could be the president of X, it could be the founder of Z, but you really want to get at least 3 different leadership experiences across the board. Now, what about research? And Dr. Y talked a little bit about, getting some of those meetings with mentors, and getting a meeting with a research mentor, I think is a big deal in sort of getting involved in laboratories and being a part of academic research in some ways that will help you show medical schools just how academically inclined you are. The reality is that most medical schools across the country, and in fact, every medical school across the country today, is based at an academic medical center. And so the professors you're working with, the physicians you're working with there are in some ways researchers. And they want to see people who are going to advance the field. We want to see intellectual curiosity in our applicants. So the average applicant, has at least one research project, right? And this is true hypothesis-based research that's supervised by, an MD, a PhD, a professor. Hopefully you get a publication out of it. Hopefully you get an abstract out of it. Hopefully you get a presentation out of it. But the minimum is at least to be involved in some of this research. And now shadowing, right? So shadowing is a question we get all the time. How many hours shadowing do you need? What do I need? So I say a minimum of 8 hours, and that's really like bare minimum because of two things. The first is that I want you as an applicant to have actually explored the career of medicine, right? So I get so many people who come in and they say, I want to apply to med school. I say, well, how many hours shadowing that you have? And they say 0. So how do you know you want to be a doctor? I have no idea how they know they want to be a doctor if they've never seen a doctor interact with a patient, if they've never seen a physician at work. How do you know? So you need to prove to medical schools, and you need to prove to yourself that medicine is what you want to do. This is a long and arduous process. I don't want you going through it if you aren't sold on it. So I think, the average is actually probably higher than 24 hours. It's probably more like 50 to 60 hours at least of some sort of shadowing experience that people get, working with a physician, seeing what they do on a daily basis. And I would say you should do this across a few different specialties, because the reality is as Dr. Ziggy can tell you, a psychiatrist is very different than an interventional radiologist, is very different than a neurosurgeon, is very different than an internist. Like while these are all doctors, these are extremely different at the end of the day. So you really want to, kind of get your feet wet across a few different specialties. Now, patient exposure is becoming more and more important. This is not shadowing. This is not you just following along, but this is you actually taking the initiative, you actually caring for a patient. Doesn't mean you're prescribing them medicines. Obviously, you can't do that, but it does mean that you're interacting with them. It means that you're helping them in some way. So hospice volunteering, volunteering in an emergency room, being an EMT, right? This is direct clinical patient exposure that you need, that medical schools want you to see, and that's kind of becoming imperative over the last few years in admissions, that we really want to see this. So you're going to need, I say, a minimum of 32, average more like 50. Some people come out with thousands of hours of, patient exposure. That's great. People who, let's say, I had an applicant who used to be an ultrasound sonographer and then wanted to go to medical school. Well, she dealt with patients every day of her life, and that was a lot of patient exposure. And so clearly, she knew what she was getting into. She knew how to talk to a patient. That's what we're trying to get at. So I know I went through that really quickly, but again, I wanted to provide you guys the highlights of what medical schools are looking for, bare minimum in some of those extracurricular activities. And then briefly, I want to take you through the timeline of applying to medical school, right? A lot of questions before on taking the MCAT. And so this is all based on if you are starting medical school in August or September of the following year. Let's backtrack our way all the way back to February or May of the year before. That's when you really have to start digging deep into your application. And that means taking the MCAT. It means starting to draft up your personal statement. It means filling in any application gaps that you may have. In May and June, that's when you start submitting your AMCAS application or your AAO-COMAS application, which goes to osteopathic schools. July, you're going to get secondaries. September onward, you're going to start interviewing at these places. Early March, you're going to get those non-rolling acceptances, and then by May 15th, hopefully you got an acceptance somewhere and you're going to commit to a school. And then even after that, there can be waitlist movement. So, the point of this timeline is to give you guys an idea of just how early you should start thinking about the process. Way back in about a year and a half before is when you should even start thinking about the application. Obviously, this timeline extends even further back, thinking about you guys who are earlier, and I'm glad that you're on this webinar because hopefully you're getting some of that insight. But if you're applying in the next year or so, this is when you want to start really getting involved in your application. I'm going to skip over this mostly. These are some of the components of the MCAT. You guys will learn this in great detail. Your MCAT also includes your transcripts and grades, as well as your letters of recommendation, your MCAT scores. You can see this is how the MCAT accumulates and spits out your grades to medical school, which includes your freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, senior year GPA. One of the things is an uptrend is super important. So if you basically go from a 3.1 in your freshman year to 3.9, 4.0 in your junior year, senior year, awesome. If you have an opposite uptrend, like this applicant did, going from a 3.8 or a downtrend, not an uptrend, but a downtrend, going from a 3.8 to 3.2, that's a little bit worrisome from a med school perspective. You can see they also separate graduate level programs, like master's level programs, which are becoming very popular, and we can talk about those in detail. And then a personal statement. I'm not even going to go into detail on this because this is a beast of its own. There's so much you need to know about the personal statement, what you want to write about, how you want to portray yourself. I mean, this is your opportunity to really show a medical school who you are and put all those experiences that I just talked about on paper, right, in a way that sells a medical school, that you are the applicant for it. And, we certainly obviously read thousands of personal statements every year to help our students. And if you're interested in our help, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we provide. But the personal statement, really a beast on its own. But join us for some upcoming webinars, and you're going to get a lot more information on that. So I know I sort of, shot through our presentation a little bit, my part of the presentation a little bit, but I wanted to take the last 10 minutes of the webinar to really get to some of the awesome questions that are being asked, and I want to allow Ken and Ziggy and myself to answer some of these questions. Before I do that, I did want to take a brief second to just tell you a little bit more about Med School Coach and what we do, as well as what the help you can get from us, because I think it's going to be super helpful for you guys who are out there to really explore some of this help, particularly as you're going through the process of applying to medical school. So there's a couple of things to share with you. Hopefully you guys can see the new screen I'm sharing here, which includes our Prospective Doctor website. So the URL is prospectivedoctor.com. This is completely free for you guys to look at, and it has a lot of awesome information out there on the medical school process. It has videos, including videos of Ken and myself. Should I retake the MCAT? How many hours should I study for it? It goes all the way up through the end of basically your life as a physician, talking about extracurricular activities, talking about everything. So check out this website. I think you're really going to find it super helpful in understanding, what you should be doing as a pre-med, and kind of, following the path of a pre-med and understanding a lot of just great information. And then there's Med School Coach. This is what we do. We do this every day, medschoolcoach.com. Basically we offer help on the MCAT with our MCAT tutoring program, as well as our MCAT video program. We offer help on admissions that helps you sort of put together a great application, figure out how to sell yourself. And then we help on USMLE tutoring and additional testing once you're in medical school. So these are sort of our three big areas of help. We would love to help you through any of this. When we help students, our success rate definitely goes up substantially, because we can really pair you with a physician. We can pair you with an MCAT expert. We can have them really help you basically make the best of your individual application. So check us out when you do have some time or need some extra help. So, without further ado, I'm going to get to some of these questions, and I'm going to ask Ziggy and Ken some of the questions that you guys are asking us, and hopefully be able to get to a couple of those. The first, and Ziggy, maybe I'll throw this question to you, is when should you start meeting with professors, making mentor type relationships, getting involved in some of the things that you were talking about early on?
Yeah, I would do it as soon as possible. I mean, as soon as you become a freshman, I would make the effort to start reaching out to, appropriate faculty and staff. Obviously, you need to have a very, important reason for why you're meeting with them, basically. But I feel like the sooner the better, because, at the beginning, that's when you can start forming all these long-term relationships that will lead to, as I had mentioned before, potentially getting a mentor, getting letters of rec, references, other connections. Those kinds of things, it's like growing a tree from a seed to a tree. That takes a lot of time, and it's not something that you can just sort of push through like the last year or the last year and a half. Of course, you can still make connections at that point, but obviously the sooner you start, the longer and the more profound those relationships will be. So I would start as soon as possible.
Awesome. Ken, here's maybe a question for you, which is the user asks, would you recommend taking more time to study for the MCAT and taking it once, or taking it sooner with less time and maybe allowing an opportunity to take it again?
Yeah, so I would say when taking the MCAT, this is generally not an exam where you want to take it with the intention of retaking it. And that's because studying for the MCAT is a very difficult process. It requires a lot of time and effort on your end. So it's certainly much better for you if you put in your full effort to do well on the exam, take it once, get the score you want, and be done.
Awesome. Ziggy, another question for you, which is, what do you do if you're a non-traditional student when it comes to maybe gaining some of these experiences? If you're out of school for a little bit, how do you gain some experiences? How do you find a doctor to shadow, let's say?
That's a great question. I think one of the keys is, talking to other experts out there. So I would honestly, well, there's a few things, most schools have like a pre-health advising center or pre-health advisors. I would go over there, make an appointment to meet with, one of the advisors there and explain your situation and ask, as I said before, the best way to get connections and referrals is to talk to other experts, basically. So I would go to your pre-health advising center and say, hey, I'm not your typical student. I'm trying to get these experiences. Who do you recommend that I reach out to? And usually they will have, a few suggestions. And then what you can do is when if you meet with, Dr. Jones, the pre-health advisor, and he says you should talk to Dr. Smith to get this certain experience, then when you send the email to the second person, you can say, oh, Dr. Jones recommended that I talk to you, basically. And then you go from there. And the other thing is to talk to peers and friends also. They might have experiences and insights into what you might want to do.
Ken, there's a lot of questions on MCAT courses, and obviously this is very, I would say, personal to each individual student, whether a course is good or not. But maybe you can take a few seconds to just walk us through what you think about when a student asks, should I take an MCAT prep course?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to consider is that there are many different ways that a student can study for the MCAT. So the first, of course, is just self-studying without taking any courses or getting any tutoring. The second is taking a classroom course, and some of the most common ones out there are from Kaplan or Princeton Review or Exam Crackers. And the third would be to get private tutoring. All of these, of course, have their pros and cons, right? So the nice thing about self-studying is it's the most essentially the cheapest option, since if you look at a lot of the MCAT courses and tutoring options out there, they can certainly require substantial investment. So that's one option, but of course the downside there is in many ways you're on your own. So for students that don't really know what they're doing for the MCAT, I would certainly recommend those students to consider tutoring or take an MCAT course. For students that are more independent and already feel like they know what they need to do for the MCAT, self-studying can be great. Between classes and tutoring, again, this is going to depend on the student. So if this is a student who feels like, they just want general review of the concepts and, they have a lot of time to spare, then certainly they can take some of those popular MCAT courses out there. The nice thing about those courses is that they'll cover a lot of topics and they'll provide you with a lot of materials. But the downside is those courses are generally geared towards the average pre-medical students. So those students aiming for a score between 508 to 510. So a lot of the information is not necessarily specific to those students that are aiming for higher scores or lower scoring students who need more help. So I would generally recommend for the students who are aiming for particularly high scores above 510, or students that have been struggling a lot with the MCAT, so scoring in the 490s, that they consider private tutoring. And that's because with private tutoring, you can work with a tutor who's not just going to give you generic information they give to all students, but a tutor who can work with you to address your specific weaknesses and help you reach your specific goals.
Awesome. Ziggy, we had a question out there that basically says, when should I know that medicine is not for me? And I think this is an interesting question because, I think, a lot of students out there obviously hang on to their pre-med goals. And I think, rightfully so, if this is what you want to do in your life, I think there are ways to get there, even if you haven't succeeded necessarily academically early on. I've worked with a lot of students who haven't done well early on, but I guess, from a general perspective, when maybe should a student think about a different path, or what do you recommend to a student who comes in and says, do I really still want to be a doctor, or is this possible for me?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think one, you have to ask yourself, and this is sort of a personal conversation that every person has with themselves, has to ask, why am I becoming a doctor in the first place, basically? I think that's the first question you have to ask. And you have to be very honest with yourself. Is it because that's what I really want to do? Or is it because there are certain expectations from my parents or, other things, basically? And I think that's sort of a first step. If you ask yourself that question and deep down inside, the answer is like, oh, because my parents want me to, I think that needs to be a red light right there, basically. And that's something you can even ask yourself freshman year, quite frankly. The pre-med process is such a very long and hard process, basically, and you don't want to go through all of that only at the end to realize that maybe that wasn't for you. And this is something I can relate to personally, because I sort of initially became a doctor because of parental expectations and realized I didn't want to do it and ended up doing something else. So when I talk to pre-meds, I often use myself as sort of an example of what not to do and to learn from that, basically. The other thing is, if you think you do want to become a doctor, and it's truly because that's what you want to do, I think it goes back to what you were saying, Dr. Mehta, about the importance of actually shadowing a doctor and having patient contact and taking care of him. If you go through that experience, whether you do it the summer between freshman and sophomore, or sophomore and junior, or whatever, whenever you do that, and you're like, ooh, I really don't like this, then I think that's a good time to be questioning if that's the right, decision for you, because that's really what the rest of your life is going to be as a doctor, basically.
Awesome. So, guys, we've come up on an hour, and I hate to do this because there's so many awesome questions out there, but we do want to be respectful of everybody's time. A lot of you guys are asking amazing questions on scribing, on, gap years, on figuring out, where to go from here in individual situations. And I really encourage a lot of you guys who are out there who are asking those questions to seek out some mentors, to get the help. Obviously, we here at Med School Coach can certainly help you through that, all those answers and those questions. We can also help you, obviously, through the application itself. Also, I wanted to highlight two other quick resources, and first is Dr. Ziggy's company, Zig Consulting. Check it out at zigconsulting.com. I think he's going to be able to offer a lot of you guys awesome, great advice on just the early college career and how to get through it. And then I also wanted to highlight one more quick resource, which is the Prospective Doctor podcast. For those of you guys who are out there who are podcast listeners, who even just want to listen to, quick 20-minute episodes while you're at the gym or while you're walking to class, that are going to give you a whole slew of awesome information on a lot of the questions you're asking about, like the MCAT, like med school interviews. Check out and subscribe to this podcast. You can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever. It's called the Prospective Doctor Podcast. and take a look and listen to a couple of these, because I think they're going to be extremely helpful. Basically, we have one-on-one interviews with experts in admissions, experts in MCAT. Ken's been on this, Ziggy's been on this, I've been on it. So I think you guys should definitely listen and take a look there. So I wanted to basically first say thank you so much to Ken and Ziggy for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time and all the information that you've shared. Thank you guys, all you guys out there who've been a part of this and have attended. You will be getting a couple of post emails, including a link to the webinar. If you want it quicker, follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, because we'll be posting it there first. I know, again, a lot of you guys have awesome questions. Seek out the help. We're here to help you should you need it. Check us out at medschoolcoach.com. Ken, thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Ziggy, thank you so much for joining us as well.
My pleasure
to have you on. And for the rest of you guys, you find us, you can see the websites, you can see our contact info. Thank you again. Good night, everybody. It's been really fun talking with you guys, and hopefully this has helped as you're going through the application process here. All right, take care, everybody.